Hello, welcome to Contact in the Desert. My name is Mark Sims, and I've been invited to do a presentation on something that I'm very excited about, and that is the Fibonacci Torus. It's a discovery I made a year ago, and I'm only now coming on the public stage to share this discovery, which I think you'll find pretty interesting, if not downright exciting. So before I get into my presentation, I just want to say a few things. First of all, the Fibonacci torus itself is something that's derived out of the Fibonacci sequence. And I'm going to explain all this to you, but I just want to give you a little preview of what we're talking about. This is the Fibonacci torus. Isn't that a thing of beauty? Look at that thing. I'm really proud of this. It's like a son, like a child I gave birth to. And I think you'll be really excited too once you understand what's going on with this thing that I discovered. All right, so I just want to, before I get started, I wanted to say thank you to the people at Contact in the Desert. This is my first appearance as a presenter. I've been an attendee before. I love this organization. I love this conference. I'm really excited to be here. So sit back, enjoy the ride. You are about to learn something new. All right. Okay, we're going to get started here. Let me pull up my presentation real quick. I need to share my screen and pick my presentation. And here we go. Here's our beautiful Fibonacci torus. I just need to pull it up and animate it. So there it is, the Fibonacci torus, a unique and beautiful visualization of the Fibonacci sequence by me, Mark Sims. That's my website, marksims.com. So before I get into it, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about myself. That's me. I told you about my website, marksims.com. I was born in the Midwest in southern Indiana. I grew up in that area of the Midwest until I was 11. I moved to Michigan with my parents and graduated from high school, got a degree in computer-aided design from Eastern Michigan University, started a career. I also went to Harvard Business School and I'm an alumni of the business school. I've started 3 companies. They're listed here. Netrix, which was an internet security company back in 1992. I sold it in 99. Retired for a while before starting my second company, Nanorex, which is a nanotechnology company. I only did that for 5 years. And then I started a third company in 2014 that was short-lived for 3 years. I decided manufacturing renewable energy systems wasn't really the best use of my energy or time. So I shut that down, moved out to California where I reside now. Other interesting little tidbits about me is that I'm an amateur ballroom dancing champion. Danced for 4 years, starting in 2009 till 2012. And that led up to my spiritual awakening that you'll be hearing about here shortly. One other thing I'd like to mention is that I'm also the executive producer for something called the Harmonic Convergence 2021. Last year, we did our inaugural Harmonic Convergence 2020 event. It was a 10-day event from July 5th to July 14th. This year, we're doing it again on the Observation Deck, a virtual platform conference center. And if you would like to know more about that, you can go to makingcontact.com, THC 2021. So I encourage you all to check it out. It's very exciting. And now that I've gotten my little plug in here, here we go. So my journey all began in 2012 when I happened to be watching YouTube videos and came across something called the Disclosure Project, which was an event that took place back in May of 2001. There's this guy, Dr. Stephen Greer, there in the middle, who was able to organize this event and get 20 very impressive people who had either been in the military or had been working for various government agencies, such as NASA or the FAA. And they all got in front of news cameras and shared these incredible stories about their experience of having either seen a UFO or encountered an extraterrestrial. And I found their stories so compelling and believable that I knew that if what they were saying was the truth, this was the biggest story in human history, and I wanted to know all about it. So when my research began on UFOs and ETs, as a consequence of the Disclosure Project, I wanted to find out more about this guy, Dr. Stephen Greer, because he was a civilian. He wasn't from the government or the military. He somehow managed these very impressive people to get in front of cameras and tell these highly strange and incredible stories in public. And so I decided to check him out and learned that he was a doctor, emergency room doctor in North Carolina, and that he had written 3 books, and here they are. So I bought these 3 books and read them. And as a consequence, I learned about something that Dr. Stephen Greer had founded, which was SETI, the study for extraterrestrial intelligence. And he had these retreats he was doing about 3 or 4 times a year that lasted typically 4, 5, or 6 days, in which he claimed to teach a meditative protocol that could initiate contact with extraterrestrials. So I looked at my schedule and decided to sign up and register for the event that was going to be taking place in Borrego Springs, California in November of 2012. This ended up being a 6-day retreat. And so after registering and paying my fee, I made my plans to fly from Detroit, Michigan, where I was living, to San Diego, rented a car, and ended up in the Palms at Indian Head Hotel in Borrego Springs, which is in the middle of the Anza Borrego Desert. And this began a 6-day retreat in which I began learning a meditative practice with a bunch of other people who were there. There were about 24 of us, and not including Greer, that had registered and were participating. Now, this is the hotel I chose to stay at. Other people stayed here as well, but there were people who stayed at Airbnbs, and Greer himself had a house nearby that he rented that we met at. I stayed in room number 3, which is right there. And the significance of that will become obvious here in a moment. But this is where I stayed over this retreat period. And this is a picture from Google Earth that kind of gives you an idea of where I was staying. So here's the Palms of Indian Head Hotel. That's where I was staying. Greer was renting this house, which was within easy walking distance from the hotel. And our fieldwork site, where we would go every evening to do this meditative practice that he called the CE5 protocol, was located north of us. So, and that was about 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile at the most away. And so this was all in very close proximity to each other. On the 5th evening of this 6-day retreat, we were all meditating, and after our first meditation, I looked up in the sky along with other people, and this object materialized out of thin air. And I saw it with my own eyes, and this is exactly what we all saw. It was an egg-shaped geodesic ellipsoid. It was very easy for me to identify because I saw it so clearly. And I recognized it. Having a background in computer graphics, I had actually rendered, while I was in college, various 3D images. And one of the images that I rendered was called a geodesic sphere, which was inspired by Buckminster Fuller, who invented the geodesic dome. And so when I saw this, I immediately recognized it. But what struck me was the fact that it appeared out of nowhere. And I saw it appear out of nothingness. And when it appeared and it was moving, I recognized that its shape was very well defined by these light edges that made these triangular facets. That is the structure of a geodesic structure. And it also had this very striking corona around it, or halo. The other thing that really struck me with a sense of awe was just the quality of the light and the color of the light. I cannot express strongly enough how unusual and beautiful it was. And I was really dumbfounded when I saw this, not only by its beauty, but also by the fact that it was an answer to this burning question that I had gone to Borrego Springs to answer. And that was, are ETs real and are they here? And with this sighting that lasted for about 3 to 4 seconds, it was a resounding yes, they are here. We are not alone. And now I was super curious. And for me, the skepticism that I had gone there initially with was lifted. I knew they were real. And now I really wanted to meet them if that was possible. So later that night, when I went back to my hotel room, room number 3 that I showed you in a previous slide, I began doing this practice of meditating, the CE5 protocol. I couldn't fall asleep, and I said, well, I might as well sit up and just try and see what happens. And lo and behold, it worked, because after about 15 minutes of me meditating, this appeared at the end of my bed. It was clearly a non-physical being. I knew that because I could see through parts of its body. On the left is the original pencil drawing that I rendered from what I saw. And later I did this illustration in Photoshop on the right to try to capture a more accurate depiction of what this being looked like. But it was clearly a being made of energy or of light. And as I stared at it, I then gave it a greeting that I practiced in the unlikely event that it would appear. And when I gave it that greeting, it slowly walked from the end of my bed, approaching me on my left side, and then reached out to touch me on the elbow, which I allowed. I just had this instinctive trust that this was a benevolent being and that I was going to allow it to touch me, as freaky as it was, the situation was. And when it touched me, I felt the touch on my elbow. Then he proceeded to push his finger into my elbow through the left side of my body, continued with his hand and forearm through the back until his shoulder began to merge with my left side. And when that happened, I was really freaking out, and it took every ounce of my free will and my willpower to sit still, because the fight or flight response was kicking in. And I had just given him my message that I completely trusted him, and I wanted to honor my word. So I forced myself to sit still, even though I was completely freaking out. And he continued to completely merge in my body. So after a few minutes of him being inside of me, I calmed down. The feeling, this tingly sensation like static electricity, had dissipated, but I was left with this acute awareness that there is an entity inside of me, and it was a very clearly a male energy. It was a dude. So I calmed down, I thought it through, and I gave him my first question, and that was, what is your name? And using my vocal cords and my lips, he said out loud, Tezbar, just like that. And I said, Tezbar? And he said, no, Tezbar. And I said, spell it. And he spelled it Tezjar, Tezbar. Once he spelled it for me and I heard him say it again, I began repeating it out loud until I got it right. And I knew I got it right because I felt a satisfaction coming from him, from within myself, that I had correctly pronounced his name. And so here he is with the correct spelling. And this is a professional illustration that I hired an artist to make for my upcoming book called Teshbar, Making Contact with a Celestial Being, that I hope to publish this year sometime. So this all happened back in 2012 on the early morning of November 16th. And 1 year later, I went back to Borrego Springs and invited all the people that I had met back in 2012 who were part of that retreat. And I also invited a handful of people from Michigan who knew about my story. This was my kind of coming out party, the first time that I was publicly speaking about that experience that had happened 1 year earlier. And I have posted this video on YouTube. And if you go to makingcontact.com/MarkSimStory, you can watch that original video from 2013 where I explain this whole story about him entering my body and what I learned over this 13 days that we were together in communion, as he called it. So that I invite you to do that. Before he left me, he encouraged me to study the following things and some other things that are not in this list, but he encouraged me to begin studying numerology, sacred geometry, superstring theory, and world religions, all which will factor in the rest of this presentation. So sacred geometry, I began doing a deep dive in it in 2013. And I started drawing these kind of figures and studying the meaning of them. And so you, I'm sure, will recognize some of these things. Of course, the most important one on this is the circle or the point, which is in the upper left-hand corner. And from there, we can create the Vesica Pisces, the equilateral triangle falls out of that, the pentagon, the pentagram, the hexagon, the seed of life, the flower of life, and Metatron's cube. And then there's some other figures on this slide, including the 9-pointed star, which I'll explain to in a moment, the yin and yang symbol, and another famous figure from the Far East, from Japanese sacred geometry there in the lower right-hand corner, which will factor into this discussion later. Another area of study, once you dive into sacred geometry, is the golden section. And here are some illustrations that come out of that study of the golden section. And I encourage anybody who's interested in this to do their own deep dive into this subject. It's a lot of fun, and I find it illuminating, to say the least. Now, vortex space mathematics was something that I eventually came upon in my study of sacred geometry. And it's an area of mathematics that was discovered by a man named Marco Rodin. Marco was a Baha'i. And if anybody knows anything about the Baha'i faith, they know that the symbol of the Baha'i is this symbol, the 9-pointed star. And according to the Baha'i, the 9-pointed star is the symbol of God. And the number 9 is the number of God. And at first I didn't get that connection and why the number 9. But if you follow along, you'll find some very interesting things about the geometry that comes out of this 9-pointed star. So I met Marco Rodin while I was studying this very deeply in 2013. I actually reached out to him and he invited him to fly from San Diego, where he was living at the time, to Michigan. And he ended up spending 9 days with me, strangely enough. And over those 9 days in which he stayed with me, he gave me a crash course on vortex space mathematics, and I went deep. And what I learned over the time we were together is the origin story of how he happened upon vortex-based mathematics. The story goes, he said, that he was sleeping as a boy, as a young man of the age of 16, where he wakes up from a lucid dream yelling, "I understand, I understand." And what he came to understand from that dream is the meaning of this symbol. And what he saw in this vision in his dream was the 9-pointed star circumscribed in a circle. And in this circle, 2 of the triangles were removed and a new symbol was drawn, connecting the numbers starting from number 1 to the number 2, from 2 to 4, from 4 to 8, from 8 to 7, 7 to 5, and back to 1. And this creates something that he came to call the doubling circuit, which I'll explain in a moment. But the other part of this symbol that he got in a dream was the symbol or triangle in the middle, connecting the numbers 3, 6, and 9. And when you put this all together, it's called the symbol of enlightenment. This is the name that Marco Rodin gave this symbol. Now, one of the interesting realities or interesting things about this symbol is the fact that it has bilateral symmetry. And what we mean by this is that if you take a vertical line and split this symbol in half, it becomes a mirror copy of itself on each side. And we see this clearly in the geometry, but we also see this interesting bilateral symmetry in the numbers. So if we add them across, all these numbers add up to the number 9. We also have something that comes out of this geometry we call number groups. So the 1, the 4, the 7 form a number group. 2, 5, and 8 form another number group, and then the 3, 6, and 9 make the final number group. Now I'm going to come back to these number groups when we start talking about the Fibonacci torus more, because these number groups are very significant in a number of ways, especially in elucidating the meaning of this Fibonacci torus and the symbol of enlightenment. The next thing we need to understand is some very rudimentary basics about something called digital root math. There's a Wikipedia page on it, so if you'd like to study more about digital root mathematics, just go to Wikipedia, search digital root mathematics, and you'll learn all you'll need to know about digital root math. But there's 2 major things that I want to share with you here. The first is the definition of a digital root is taking any number, let's call that number n, and adding up all of its digits until you get a single digit. And here's some examples. If we take the multi-digit 1, 2, 3 and add them together, we get the number 6. If we take another number here, this example 2,894, and I'll add all of its digits together, we get the number 23. And if you add 2 and 3 together, you get the number 5, which is the digital root. So there's 2 iterations of this process required in some numbers and sometimes more. Okay, so that's what digital root math is. That's where a digital root is in digital root mathematics. The other thing that you have to know is that the number 9 and the number 0 are equivalent in digital root mathematics. That is to say that if you add the number 9 to any number n and compute its digital root, you end up with the original digital root of the number n. And so here, the first example I gave was 123. If we add 9 to that, we get a new number, 132. If we add those digits together, 1 plus 3 plus 2, we get the number 6. If we take the second example of 2,894 and add 9 to that, we get the number 2,903. We add those digits together, we get 14. So we have to do one more iteration again. 1 plus 4 equals 5. That's our original root of 2,894. So again, remember 9 and 0 are the same number. And in fact, you could go so far as to say in digital root mathematics, there really is no number 0. Only the number 9 really exists in digital root mathematics. So now I'm going to introduce you to something that falls out of vortex-based mathematics and the symbol of enlightenment, and that is called the doubling circuit. We start with the number 1 here highlighted in blue, and we double that number to get to the next number in the circuit, which would be the number 2. We double 2, takes us to 4. Then we double 4, that gets us to 8. And we double 8, and that gets 16. But remember, we're applying digital root math here. So if we add 1 and 6 together, that takes us to 7. If we double 16, that gets 32. And if we add 3 and 2 together, that takes us to 5. So that's how we get to 5. And then if we double 32, which is 64, we add 6 and 4 together, that gives us 10. We add 1 and 0 together, that gets us back to 1, and the circuit is now closed, making it a circuit. So this is a number sequence. Think of it as a sequence of numbers that's a closed loop or a circuit in which we're constantly doubling, and this will continue into infinity. In fact, let's look at the number 7 right there. If we double the number 7, that's 14. 1 plus 4 takes us to 5. If we double 5, that's 10. That's 1 plus 0. That's 1. So there you go. So here I've got a little animation of it. And while we watch this animation taking us through the sequence of the doubling circuit, I want you to look at the 6 and the 3. Now, the 3 and the 6 are on their own. If we double 3, we get 6. We double 6, we get 12. That takes us back to 3. If we double 12, that takes us to 24. That gets us back to 6. So we have this oscillation dynamic happening within the 3 and the 6. The 9, however, stands on its own, so to speak, because if we double 9, we always return to 9. And so the 3, 6, and the 9 make this triad in this symbol. And we could go so far, in fact, in vortex-based mathematics, Marco Rodin suggests that the 3, the 6, and the 9 make up the heartbeat of the universe or the heartbeat of God. So each one of these oscillations you can think of as a ticking clock. And each time the clock ticks, we advance along the doubling circuit. And this principle is at the core of vortex-based mathematics. Now I'm going to introduce you to the halving circuit, which is exactly the same thing as the doubling circuit, only we're going in the other direction, starting with the number 1. So if we start with the number 1, or we could start with the number 5. Let's start with the number 5. If we take the number 5 and we divide it in half, that would get us to 2.5. We add 2 plus 5, that gets us to 7. We divide 7 in half, and that gets us 3. What is 7 divided by 2? Well, anyway, I'm just going to, too many numbers here anyway, but you can see here what's happening. I've got the math represented in the top right below the number 9, and you can see now we have a sequence that goes in the opposite direction. 1 to 5 to 7 to 8, back to 4, 2, 1, 5, and here's the halving circuit. And all we're doing simply is dividing each number in half. Now there's one other thing before we move on. The Enneagram is also a well-known figure in sacred geometry that has a lot of philosophy and significance associated with numerology. And I just want to show you a cool animation which shows an illustration which I believe is simply a slight perspective adjustment on a multi or higher dimensional object. And so we're just changing our perspective by switching those points on 1 and 8. We're swapping them. And this will become more and more important throughout my talk about the significance of the 1 and the 8 being, let's call it, a boundary condition between perspectives of a higher dimensional object. Okay, so we'll just leave it for there because I want to stay focused on the Fibonacci torus. Okay, so the torus comes out of a special sequence called the Fibonacci sequence. And here is the Fibonacci spiral that comes out of the Fibonacci sequence. And so the Fibonacci sequence, I'm going to come back to this. Here's the Fibonacci sequence. It's simply a sequence of numbers in which each number is the sum of the two preceding numbers, starting with the numbers 0 and 1. So the first line of numbers here in orange are the first 12 numbers of the Fibonacci sequence, starting with 0 and 1. So it goes like 0, 1, and the next number is 1 because 0 plus 1 is 1. We add 1 and 1 to get 2. 1 and 2 equal 3, 2 and 3 equal 5, 3 and 5 equal 8, 5 and 8 equal 13, etc., etc. Now, what we are going to do, however, is replace each one of these numbers in the sequence with the digital root equivalent. And you know how to do that now. So what we get with, as a result, is the bottom row of numbers. And you can see it starts out all the same until we get to the 4 in that sequence, which was 13 originally, but we're adding 1 and 3 together to get 4, and then 21 we add together to get 3, etc. Before I move on, I just want to point out that in digital root math, this rule of adding the previous 2 numbers to get the next number in the sequence still works. For instance, if we add 8 and 4 together, that adds up to 12, which equals 3. If we add 4 and 3 together, that gets 7. We add 3 and 7 together, that gets 10, which is 1. We add 7 and 1 together, that gets 8. So this is just something that is a cool consequence of computing the digital root of a number, that this continues to work. And we call this sequence now the reduced Fibonacci sequence. So now I'm just going to go back really quickly to show you the Fibonacci spiral, and you can see how this spiral evolves out of this sequence. But this is the original sequence, not the reduced sequence, the top row of numbers, not the bottom. Okay, so here you see the numbers 13, 21, 34, and 55. You'll see them up there in that sequence above. So the Fibonacci, it turns out, has a repeating pattern. I should say the reduced Fibonacci sequence has a repeating pattern every 24 numbers. And here they are down below, starting with the number 0. The first row of numbers are the first 12 numbers, and then the second row is the second row of numbers with their original numbers above in the pattern. So I've just simply taken the original 24 numbers at the top, computed their digital equivalents, and organized them into 2 rows of 12. So there turns out to be a very cool symmetry that falls out of this sequence. And I'm going to show it to you. Here it is, those first 2 rows of numbers, and or the 24 numbers organized into 12 numbers each. And you can see if we add them together, they all add up to the number 9. Now, the number 0 here, I'm going to take the liberty of changing into the number 9 here, but still this works, right? So remember that rule that 9 and 0 are equivalent in digital root math. So if I put a 9 in place of a 0, I can still add these 2 numbers together, 9 plus 9 in the first column, and that adds up to 18, and I apply digital root math to the 1 and the 8, and that gets me back to the 9. So if we take this sequence of 24 numbers and put them into a circle, since we recognize a cyclical nature of the Fibonacci sequence, at least the digital root Fibonacci sequence, we could end up with something that looks like this. The orange numbers around the circle are the Fibonacci sequence reduced to their digital root equivalents. Again, we call this the reduced Fibonacci sequence. There are 24 numbers in this circle of numbers, starting with 9 at the top. Remember, this is going to be our starting position at the very top. And what I'm going to do is just show you something really cool. Now, I've already made this point that when you add these numbers up on opposite positions or at 180 degrees relative to one another, they always are going to add up to 9. So here's 1 and 8. Here's another 1 and 8. Here's a 2 and a 7. 3 and a 6, they add up to 9. A 5 and a 4. An 8 and a 1. A 4 and a 5. A 3 and a 6. A 7 and a 2. A 1 and an 8. An 8 and a 1. And we're back to 9 again. And I've got a little cool animation here that you can watch here for a moment. And just look at this. It's just so simple and so cool to watch. This, we'll call it duality of symmetry. We'll call it a duality of symmetry going on here. And it's one of the many dimensions of symmetry, okay? Turns out there's lots of dimensions of symmetry here, and we're just now exploring the very first dimensions of symmetry in this thing called this Fibonacci torus. And we're not even at the torus yet. Even though I've got this purple figure, which is the torus itself, I've not yet shown you the full torus itself. And that's going to take place here in a moment. But before we do that, I want to introduce you to the bilateral symmetry within the Fibonacci torus. And so to do that, I'm going to take us back to the bilateral symmetry that exists within the symbol of enlightenment. So we've seen this earlier, where there's this mirror symmetry if we divide this symbol laterally. And it's not just that the symbol has this symmetry bilaterally, but also the numbers have symmetry. So if we take this figure that I just showed you, and we divide it with an imaginary line that is vertical, we have some interesting symmetry that comes out of this. Every other number has the same kind of symmetry that we see in the symbol of enlightenment. That's cool, right? There's also these other numbers that we skipped over, starting with the top numbers 1 and 1, 2 and 2, 5 and 5, 4 and 4, 7 and 7, and 8 and 8. And here I show you something really cool. These are the number groups that we talked about earlier that come out of the symbol of enlightenment. That the 2, the 1, the 4, the 7, 2, 5, and an 8 happen to be the numbers in the doubling circuit and the halving circuit. And here we see more symmetry along the vertical line. Again, but we call this bilateral symmetry. We see two triangular figures that are represented by the number group 1, 4, and 7. And there's two of them. And they are bilaterally symmetrical. We also have two other triangular numeric groups represented by the 2, 5, and 8. Again, they are symmetrical as well, bilaterally speaking. The next thing I want to show you is that if we apply this rule that we've had in the doubling circuit by starting with the number 1 and going to number 2, something really interesting happens here. So starting with the number 1, I selected the number 1, which is the second number in the sequence of the reduced Fibonacci sequence. So I'm going from 1 to 2, and now I'm going to go from 2 to 4 on the other side of the symbol, which is what we do in the symbol of enlightenment. And then we go from 4 to 8 rather. Here's 4 to 8. And then we go from 8 to 7, just like we do in the symbol of enlightenment. And then we go from 7 to 5. And then we double 5 to get back to 1. Does that look familiar, that symbol? Well, it sure does. Right from the symbol of enlightenment, there it is. And if we rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, we have a direct copy. Now, it turns out that this symbol also exists bilaterally, symmetrically on the other side of the Fibonacci torus. And here it is. Voila. And if we put up the symbol of enlightenment and we rotate it counterclockwise 90 degrees, we have now found the symbol embedded within the Fibonacci torus. Amazing, right? Well, it gets better. Here we have the 3, 6, and 9 shown, and there are 2 number groups found within the Fibonacci torus of the 3, 6, and 9, and they make something really recognizable, the Star of David. Okay, and so pretty cool, right? Well, it gets better. Because there's trilateral symmetry within the Fibonacci torus. Oh my goodness. So I'm going to remind you of the number groups that are in the symbol of enlightenment. We have the 1, 4, and 7. We have the 2, 5, and the 8. And we also have the 3, 6, and the 9. These are the 3 number groups within the symbol of enlightenment. I just want to remind you of these. These are very important because these number groups are embedded and fall out of the Fibonacci torus over and over and over again among many dimensions of perspective. So here's the first one that we've already visited, and here's another one. Okay, so I'm rotating this triangle by 15 degrees to get to the next number sequence, and we have a group of numbers. This is the number group 1, 4, and 7. Now we have, in the next degree of rotation, the all ones. Now, what I've taken the liberty of doing is drawing the sum of all the numbers that I've circled to compute the sum in the center. So I'm going to just go back here for a second. Here we have the number 9. If you compute the sum of all the 3 digits in this number group, if we add the 1, the 4, and the 7, oops, I have a mistake. This is actually adds up to the number 12. That should be a 3. So I need to fix this in my presentation. I'll do that later. And then this is the number, these add up to the number 3. Here's the 2, 5, and 8, and that adds up to 15. 1 and 5 equals 6. That's the center number. I got that right. 3, 6, and 9, that adds up to 9. 2, 5, and 8, we know adds up to 6. 8, 8, and 8, that adds up to 24. 2 plus 4 equals 6. 1, 4, and 7 add up to 3. I got it right that time. We have 3, 6, and 9. And if we just animate this, I'll just let this go. Watch this for a moment. Just sit back and study this. Study the beauty in this trilateral symmetry. Now, center on the center number. I want you to focus on the number in the middle, which is the sum of all the 3 numbers in these number groups. Notice that it's always 3, 6, or 9. This is very significant, especially for those of you that study vortex-based mathematics. You'll know that this is a very significant pattern of numbers that's has everything to do with the 3-dimensional form of the symbol of enlightenment that Randy Powell discovered when he was a student of Marco Rodin. Okay, so enough of that. I'm going to move on here. And what I'm going to do here now is just show you the all the 6 numbers. And here, it's just another interesting animation. What is significant here that I'm adding up all the 6 numbers highlighted on the Fibonacci sequence to then add up to the center, and they always add up to 9. Pretty straightforward. Okay, well, symmetry goes even further. I've introduced you to the bilateral symmetry and the trilateral symmetry. It ends up that we have what's called supersymmetry. And I just want to introduce you to this term. Supersymmetry comes out from an area of astrophysics called superstring theory, another thing that Tejbar encouraged me to learn and study, which I have in great depth. And so let's take a look at what supersymmetry might mean from a geometric standpoint. So here we know what this is. This is our Fibonacci sequence, our reduced Fibonacci sequence with the Metatron's cube symbol that I've drawn here to help illustrate the multidimensionality of this, or the supersymmetry of this Fibonacci torus. But to really understand the full power of and implications of multidimensionality embedded within this amazing geometric structure, I need to show you more numbers, and here they are. Now, what you're looking at are 9 concentric circles of numbers, 24 numbers each. Each are the Fibonacci sequence. So the small inside circle of numbers is the Fibonacci sequence, the second ring of numbers, the third ring of numbers, and if you count them, turns out to be 9 concentric rings of circles. And what I'm going to do here is animate this eventually, but I'm just going to take you back and forth here. So what we're doing is cycling through a set of numbers. And these numbers, you'll notice, are that they increment and decrement. So let me go back to the beginning here. So here's the beginning process. The number 9 at the top, highlighted in blue, I want you to pay attention to that number. And the number that's in that diamond where the 9 is positioned at the top of the Metatron cube is the number that we're going to focus on. And again, I highlight the number just below it in slightly larger blue so that we can easily identify it and read it in this presentation. So watch, okay, we have the 9 there. I'm going to cycle it. Now we have a 1, a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we're back to 9 again. I'm going to let this animate while we watch this together. Just admire this for a moment because there's some really amazing stuff. First of all, I want you to just think for a moment that each one of these concentric circles of numbers, of which there are 9, is the Fibonacci sequence reduced to its digital root sequence. Okay, it's the reduced Fibonacci sequence. But I'm just simply incrementing each one of those to get to the next sequence, or the next, we'll call it the next concentric ring of this Fibonacci sequence. So you can think of this as these numbers emanating out of the center of the torus, the very middle of it. And if you look, for instance, at the number 1 here at the very top, you follow out, that's all ones in that radial arm that pops out from the middle. But if you look at it at other numbers, you'll see if you follow one of the numbers, it just is radiating out along that radial arm. And I'm going to make this clear here in a moment if it's not obvious. But now just look at these numbers and just notice that they all are sequences, simple sequences that are incrementing by 1 or decrementing by 1. Okay? Here's another illustration of the very same thing. Okay, I'm going to let this animate. And this makes it more obvious, what I was showing you in the previous slide, that these numbers are emanating out from the middle of the torus, extending outwards, and each time we get a new sequence. But that sequence is simply the Fibonacci sequence, because each one of these concentric rings is the Fibonacci sequence. But notice what's happening here. Each one of these radial arms is also a numeric sequence that goes into infinity. It loops back on itself. Do you see that? Okay, so I'm going to make this a little bit easier for you to see. But before I do, I just want to highlight the outer numbers because they are not the sequence itself. These are the increments of each one of the radial arms. So for instance, if we look at this arm I've highlighted in green, it starts on the inside with the number 8. Then it increments by 1 to 9, then back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've added a +1 at the end of that radial arm emanating from the center to indicate the increment for that arm. And I've done so for all the other ones as well. If we look at the other side, I've highlighted now another arm. This is one that is incrementing by 8. And you can see I put a +8 at the end of that arm. How did I do that? Or why did I do that? Because if you look at the innermost number, that number 1, that's the starting number of that increment of that arm. You add 8 to it, you get to 9. That's clear. You add 8 to 9, that gives you 17. We compute the digital root, which is 8. We add 8 to 8, that's 16. That gets us to 7. We add 8 to 7, that's 15. 1 plus 5 equals 6. So now you see it looks like this is a number sequence that decrements by 1, which indeed it does. But in digital math, that's synonymous with adding 8. Okay, so subtracting 1 or adding 8 are synonymous in digital root math. But I'm using all positive numbers to illustrate the increments. And what I want to really surprise you with is the fact that these orange increment numbers are the reduced Fibonacci sequence. Let me say that again, read it with me. The radial arm increments form the reduced Fibonacci sequence. Isn't that amazing? This is what I am getting at with the multidimensional nature of the torus and the sequences that come from it. There's all sorts of surprises in this thing. So here we go. The next surprise is that we have sacred geometry that come out of this. Now, before I show you sacred geometry, I just did a little trick here. I'm going to do it again. This is the torus without the animation. I'm rotating at 180 degrees. And the reason I'm doing this is because so far we're just seeing one side of the torus. We're not seeing the bottom side. We're seeing what we'll call the northern hemisphere of a donut-shaped object. So we're just seeing the surface. But if we take the surface, the northern hemisphere, we rotate it 180 degrees and then project it back behind the original northern hemisphere, you can see something interesting. What we see here is that we have a new symmetry up here. Now, it's not really obvious at first, but just listen and watch. Pick any number on the face of this torus. And what you're looking at when it's highlighted in green is the northern face of the torus, the original northern hemisphere of the torus. But behind it, on the other side, is the complement to that number. So what I mean by that is the number that will, when added to the northern hemisphere number, will always add up to 1. So let's let's just pick one. I'm going to pick this number 9 right here. On the other side of that 9, well, it's kind of hard to see, but let's pick this 8 right here. If you can see the 8 coming out of this black arm, the number 1 is going to be on the other side of it. A 7, it's going to be a 2. This 1, it's going to be 8. This is an easy one to see. So, let's look at this arm of all ones. Of course, the complement to all ones is going to be all 8s. And that you can clearly see here. So pay attention to this arm. So I hope that's clear. So we have symmetry not only radially, we have symmetry projecting through the screen. That's another dimension of symmetry. Okay, so back to the animation. Now what I just want to show you is the seed of life comes out of this. And another sacred geometry figure, which is one of my favorites, the yin and yang symbol. So here, what I've just shown you is if we use the 1 and the 8s as a boundary condition and color one side of that boundary white and the other boundary black, we have the yin and yang symbol. And if we take the 3 and the 6 and we switch colors, we have the dots of the yin and yang symbol. I don't think this is a coincidence. So the other thing that I just like to say before I move on is that the center of this torus, you can think of as the emanation of all these numbers and patterns that give rise to the geometry that is this multidimensional object. And in vortex-based mathematics, Marco Rodin himself says it all emanates from the number 9. So if you think of the number 9 as in the center of this torus, and on opposite sides of that, we have the 3 and the 6, imagine that being a trine here that projects again through the screen, and that number 9 is at the center, while the 3 and the 6 is on the surface of the torus. We have another triangle, but we see it as a straight line. Just imagine that. I want to make this point because it's so significant. It's another opportunity to show the multidimensionality and the symmetry of this figure. Okay, now for the coup de grace, the Universal Consciousness Development Chart, the multidimensional nature of reality. Back in 2012, during my 13-day communion with Tejbar, much of our time was spent talking about the nature of consciousness and how it evolves to create the reality we observe and experience. He shared with me that we are units of consciousness. That's you and me are units of consciousness contained within this package we call the physical body. And to get here, he claims we went through a lengthy process that took place through reincarnation. The modus operandi of our evolution is reincarnation in an area or a realm he referred to as the physical realm. The journey, our journey, began long, long ago at the minute of the Big Bang. But at some point through that process that was the Big Bang, the universe, the physical universe that we love and see around us, gave rise to stars and planets and solar systems and eventually life forms like us. But before you get life forms like us, you have to first create simpler life forms, single cell organisms, and then multi-cell organisms. And then that gives rise to algae and other more complex life forms. And then you get plants. And then finally you get animals. And that's where this journey begins in our story, at least in this chart. In the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a picture of a fly. According to Tejbar, this is where our journey begins as individuated conscious units. And our container is the body of the fly. And into that container that is the body of the fly, a spark of consciousness is given in which it can experience itself in the physical realm. And it turns out that after the fly dies, it's reincarnated, at least according to Tejbar, through many, many thousands of lifetimes. That in this chart is represented by that stage number 1, where the fly exists. And that little R with the arrow that loops back on itself is a symbol representing reincarnation happening time and time again within the first stage of conscious evolution in the animal kingdom. But at some point, after many thousands of lifetimes, we move to stage 2. And that is the stage of reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And again, we continue this process through thousands of lifetimes until we enter stage 3, the stage of birds and waterfowl. And then after thousands of lifetimes, as birds and waterfowl were born into the mammalian and the marsupial animal families. And after thousands of lifetimes as mammals and marsupials, eventually we reach the level of conscious maturity to have our first human incarnation, and something magic happens. We become human for the first time in a human body. And so according to Tejbar, we've gone, each of us, through this process of 4 major stages of conscious evolution before we become human beings. So it's in the 5th stage of this process that we reach or achieve human level consciousness. And again, according to Tejbar, we are just half or a third of the way through a 15-stage process that he described to me. Now, I don't have time in this presentation to go through all of it. All I want to tell you is this, that we are about to enter a new phase of our collective conscious evolution, both individually and collectively as a human family. And I'll be talking about that during the Harmonic Convergence 2021. But before I end this presentation, I just want to say, I just want to finish up with a few things here. It turns out that these 15 stages of conscious evolution are organized into 3 rows in this chart. And these rows correspond to 3 realms of creation labeled on the left-hand side of the chart. The first is the celestial realm. And according to Tejbar, this was the original realm that came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. Only the celestial realm existed. It was the realm of pure, undifferentiated consciousness. It was the mind of God, you could call it, or the Great Spirit. And through the early time of the evolution of that universe that gave birth to the universe that we see now, it was all undifferentiated consciousness. It was homogeneous consciousness. It was one mind, you could say, because there was no differentiation. But as that universe, as this early universe evolved, the leading edge was cooling down. And that gave rise at some point to the second realm of creation that was called the astral realm. And that's represented in this chart by the middle row. And the stages of conscious evolution here, numbered 6 through 10, are the stages that take place within this astral realm, of which we are going to be entering. And then the final realm that in most dense of these realms that was created was the physical realm. And this took place at a point in time in the history of our early universe in which the consciousness that began to differentiate during the astral stage of evolution. And this gave rise to what we call the elementary particles found in the standard model of physics. particles I'm talking about are things like quarks, bosons, fermions, all the electrons, quarks, gluons. They're the force particles, or the particles we associate with force, and other particles that end up aggregating to create things like protons. For instance, there's 3 particles or elementary particles that form the subatomic particle, a proton. It's 3 quarks with 3 gluons. The gluons are the force particles, and the gluons, or the quarks, are the particles themselves that come together to form a proton. And then protons come together with electrons to create the first element in the periodic table of elements, and that is the hydrogen atom, represented by a dot for the nucleus, which is a single proton, and the outer circle, which is the electron. And that's a symbol that we all know, we all are familiar with. It's a symbol of the hydrogen atom. So this all takes place at this moment where the expanding universe is continuing to cool down, and you can think of it as the state of matter transitioning from liquid into a solid. Okay, that just, as an analogy, think of it that way. And all of a sudden, the early universe has countless hydrogen atoms coming into existence. And this is the first form of matter that has a property we call mass. Previously, none of these particles had mass, but now that we have these elementary particles able to come together and stay together and aggregate and form particles we call protons, and then electrons that join with them to create the first atoms, we have now a physical universe. Now, as that physical universe continues to expand and more hydrogen gas is created, or hydrogen atoms, and these big clouds of hydrogen gas are formed, because of the fact that they have mass, they attract to one another, and they form these large spherical clouds of hydrogen. And what happens in this very center of these large gaseous clouds, there's great pressure put on the hydrogen atoms in the center, and they end up eventually fusing together to create a new element, helium, which has 2 protons and 2 electrons. But when that fusion of 2 hydrogen atoms happens, something also happens, and that is the release of energy in the form of heat and light and other electromagnetic radiation. And that lights up, in effect, the first stars in the early universe. So the first celestial body that is born in this early physical universe, before we were close to being created or coming into being, was the star, okay? And the star then burns through its nuclear fuel, and it continues to fuse atoms together into heavier elements until eventually one of 2 things happens. It runs out of fuel and it becomes a brown dwarf and then dies, or it will implode into what's called a supernova, which creates such great pressure and heat that all the heavy elements we find in the periodic table are created at once and then exploded and spewed out into the void of space, where they begin to cool down, coalesce into things we call planets. And this is how solar systems are born. Okay, so I've just taken you through a very quick example of how these 3 realms of creation are created. So in the celestial realm, you have undifferentiated consciousness in the form of pure homogeneous energy. Then a differentiation happens in which these elementary particles that are in the standard model of elementary particles are created. And then eventually the physical universe is created the moment that we have the first atoms that form, and they aggregate to create stars, and they then explode to create the heavier elements, and those heavier elements come together, create molecules and other elements or other compounds and other things that give rise to life like us. So that's the three realms. Now, over the top of this, you have 15 dimensions of consciousness. And in the physical realm, the 15 dimensions of consciousness are the 5 physical senses, okay? So we can only have the 5 physical senses if we have a physical body. We have to have eyes to see, ears to hear, a tongue to taste, a nose to smell with, and fingers and skin that allow us to feel. So that's the thing that, you can't have the 5 physical senses without having a physical body. And relative to the astral and celestial, the physical senses are much more dense in terms of experiential inputs to consciousness, and we are consciousness. We are, you can think of us as a point of consciousness, and that we have these inputs that make us aware of our immediate surroundings, and it's our body, it's our organs of our body. But we also have these dormant dimensions of awareness that are available to us that exists at the astral level. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Astral projection, or remote viewing, which is another name for astral projection, is a well-documented dimension of consciousness that some people can actually use to remotely view places that their physical body isn't near. So that's one example. And it turns out there are other dimensions of consciousness at the astral level, 4 other dimensions. I'll just give you a hint. The sixth sense, intuition, or ESP, is one of them. Telepathy is one of them. So I'm not going to mention all of them right now because I'm running out of time. And then there are 5 dimensions at the celestial level too that we would associate with God realization or God consciousness, things like omniscience, omnipresence. And some of us have had those experiences as well. They're not part of our normal experience, but there are states of consciousness, especially meditative states, that people have had in which they have experienced God realization or omniscience or being one with all things. And this is what I'm referring to at this highest level of consciousness. So it turns out that according to Tejbar, there are 15 dimensions of consciousness. And I just illustrated some of those in the yellow area. Then you have 9 dimensions of freedom, of which are 3 spatial dimensions are a subset. According to Tejbar, the universe, as when it was first created, gave rise to 9 dimensions of freedom. But the physical realm is limited to a subset of those 9 dimensions. At the astral level, you have access to 6 of those dimensions of freedom. And at the highest celestial level, all 9 dimensions of freedom are fully available. 2 dimensions of time on the far right, I will quickly explain, are real time or linear time. That's what we experience in the physical realm. And imaginary time, which is a very well-defined concept in mathematics. And it's all based on this magical number, this imaginary number, literally called the square root of -1. And I encourage you, after you watch my video, to Google imaginary time and imaginary numbers. And there's some really great YouTube videos where you can learn all about that and apply imaginary numbers to real world problems in engineering and elsewhere that are useful in solving problems. It's amazing. But what Tejbar said about imaginary time is that we use our minds to access this dimension of time continuously to retrieve a memory or to plan in the future for some objective or goal for ourselves. Like if we are planning a big trip, maybe a year from now, we've got to put in the plan. So we imagine a goal for ourselves that we're going to be like in somewhere other place in the world. We've got to make our plans, like make the flight arrangements. We have to pack. We need to make sure that somebody's watching our dog if we own a dog. All those plans have to be made in place. And so this imaginary process happens in our mind, planning for the actual manifestation of this future objective. And he claims that it's our mind that can traverse this dimension of time that is a very real thing and is one of the 26 dimensions of conscious or dimensions of reality that are contained within this chart. So 26, this number 26 comes from adding 15 dimensions of consciousness to 9 dimensions of freedom and 2 dimensions of time. That adds up to 26. What's significant about that? Well, it turns out that 26 is the number of dimensions predicted by 2 of the 8 string theories that make up the full body of superstring theory. So in the upper left-hand side of this chart, you'll see a colored table starting with the 2 orange columns. These are the names of the superstring theories on the left, along with the dimensions predicted by each. At the top, we have bosonic closed and bosonic open. They predict 26 dimensions of reality. Doesn't say what these dimensions are. It says there's got to be 26 dimensions for our models to predict all the elementary particles that we find in the standard model of elementary particles. So that's what they did. They solved it purely from a mathematical perspective. The next 5 superstring theories all predict 10 dimensions. And then the most well-known, which is M theory at the bottom, predicts 11 dimensions of reality. And how do they get to these different numbers? Well, it is my hypothesis that they come from this chart, that the bosonic closed and open include in the mathematics something that happens to incorporate consciousness. Somehow they did it through pure math. And I leave that for you to discover. There's a prediction of a particle that's never been discovered that I believe will be one day hopefully discovered, that will be called the consciousness particle. It's a particle that they had to invent that's never been discovered to solve all the math that allows them to predict all the other particles that the bosonic closed and open math predicts correctly. So we have 15 dimensions of consciousness plus 9 dimensions of freedom and 2 dimensions of time. That adds up to 26. Well, M theory here, it only incorporates the 9 dimensions of freedom, these higher dimensions that I spoke of, and 2 dimensions of time. And that's how you get to the number 11. And then the other 5 dimension or superstring theories only incorporate the 9 dimensions of freedom and 1 dimension of linear time to predict 10 dimensions. So there you go. Okay, I'm almost done, but I'm going to leave you with a famous, well, I guess it's not famous yet, but I hope this is a famous quote because I think it's worthy. The theory of everything isn't an equation. It's a number that evolves from nothing to become everything. And if you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to makingcontact.com/THC2021, because we're going to do the harmonic convergence. And for people who come to the harmonic convergence, I'm going to share with you what I mean by all this. I'm going to take the harmonic, the universal consciousness development chart, and put it together with the Fibonacci Torus, and it's going to be pretty profound. So I leave you with this, whoops, that's, this is supposed to be an animation of Tejbar cramming everything into my head. So I'll just leave that there. And then this is a little clue to that quote I just gave. So I hope you have a lovely day. God bless you. Namaste. Hope to see you at the Harmonic Convergence, and have a wonderful, wonderful contact in the desert.